There are a lot of factors one might consider important when building a world. Every person has a different idea about what must or should be included in this process, but they also do not want to achieve the same thing. Some favor grounded settings that barely differ from the real world. Others wish to create something truly alien or almost abstract. Grim darkness, quippy humor, wholesome relations, or a mix of these elements. The majority of what we think about when sitting down to construct a setting are up to our subjective preferences. If I look back at my modest library of related videos, they cover topics that might not even come up for numerous settings. Hell, they don't all apply to my primary project, and I'm the one choosing these subjects. The main reason for this is rather simple. There are very few aspects of worldbuilding I'd call essential. I've lately been hesitant to make such definitive statements, but there are two that might fit that definition. One is consistency, for obvious reasons. You'd want the building blocks and rules of your world to be consistent to make sure audiences remain invested, since narrative satisfaction comes from deliberate writing rather than momentary whims. The second such aspect is that the setting itself makes sense in the first place. Its elements can coexist and no rules are contradictory. This would be my definition of realistic. This factor is already highly restrictive about the way you can achieve certain goals, so much so that I doubt even half of all well-known worlds qualify. There can always be exceptions, but I'd cite these as the load-bearing pillars of fictional universes. If someone is telling you that there are strict rules to world building and they go beyond these two fundamentals, well, it's like rules of writing. There are no rules, only guidelines of varying importance. So I've laid down what can be considered as the foundation of the vast majority of world building. Things we can almost always rely on as indicators of quality. Right on top of this proverbial foundation are elements that are only marginally less important. Aspects that a setting can do with or without, but their presence or lack alone have far-reaching consequences for everything built on top of them. One of these is free will. Now, this episode is one of the increasingly rare instances where I did not put up a poll beforehand. I wanted to talk about free will for some time now. Not only because it is a really important part of worldbuilding, but because, well, I have become progressively more and more annoyed at the discourse around the topic in general. I have listened to a variety of people talking about whether or not us, real living people, have free will or not. Each conversation steadily raising my blood pressure. I don't even know if the arguments on either side made me more upset, or the fact that seemingly none of the parties had the same definition about what free will is. Yes, this is another one of those topics where definitions are extremely important, and precious few care enough about a constructive conversation to try and start off on the same page. But I care. Not only because I wish to have a little segment where I talk about free will in real life, but also because we cannot even begin to explore how it relates to worldbuilding if I just throw vague terms around. Plus, I do want to vent a little about some conclusions I was forced to make about the apparent definitions of others. But free will is a complex thing, one we should begin dissecting through examples first. And just to be clear, we do not necessarily need to agree on the definition here, but it is the one I'll base my points on in the second half of the video. So, what is free will? The most obvious answer would be the ability to make a choice. You choosing what clothes to wear, or how to react to another person's actions, whether you blow your money on board games, or save it instead to buy a car later. Simple binary choices or branching paths you may take. But there aren't always choices, or at least we do not conceptualize certain situations as choices. Some of these wouldn't even be manifestations of free will, I don't think. You don't choose to breed, you do that automatically. You may choose not to, but only for so long, until the instincts kick you back into autopilot. I'd say this right here is a pretty good example of the difference between free will and the lack thereof. But we'll get back to this a bit later. So, what else can qualify as practicing free will? Well, extrapolating on the idea of choices, acting on thoughts other than base impulses would be another example. Say, feeling hungry and eating some food as a result can be argued as a thoughtless reaction, and while the execution may invoke elements of free will, The start and end points might not, but you may decide that you want to eat less or healthier. Perhaps something you don't really like. You believe it will be good for you, even though your base impulses would compel you to just eat what tastes good and as much as you can. A more serious example of this can be letting go of people, or cutting them out of your life for one reason or another. People you care about, I mean. When your relationship would be to the detriment of either of you, this is a potential route one might take, but not one often treaded. Making this decision goes against what you'd normally want, causing a lot of heartache, especially if only the other party would be negatively impacted, and you are giving up your own happiness in the process. Again, this is going against your primal wants and needs, beyond what evolutionary pressure would construct as the default behavior. A tough decision, one I don't see anyone sane making on autopilot. With all that said, let's get back to the example of feeling hungry and then eating. I said it can be argued as not being a manifestation of free will, but the execution and preparation are. Feeling hungry is something automatic. It is your body telling you to go get food, because you are running low on energy. However, gathering food is not as easy as just flipping a switch. It used to be significantly harder, but requires acting on your hunger even today. Whether it's going to the grocery store, hunting elk, or reaping wheat, these are actions we generally do in preparation of feeling hungry in the future. These are absolutely conscious actions that involve making choices, learning, improving, strategizing, all that fun stuff. The end result is that we will have raw materials when feeling hungry. Those raw materials will often need some preparation, cooking, and even separating spoiled food from the rest. Some of these actions need learning and experience, and definitely do not fall into the mindless category. Now, if getting food was literally as easy as pressing a button and some tube splurting pre-processed edibles into your mouth, that would be different. Anything you do without really paying attention, just working off of instinctual or imprinted behavior, I would not consider as practicing free will. Reacting to sudden movements, a loss of balance, breathing, vomiting, and other less savory deeds. Basically anything you cannot help but do. Actions your body practically commits for you. That is what I would consider not free will. Anything you do consciously, what you choose to do, what you act out with thought behind it, that is free will. This seems like a fairly straightforward definition, but the lines are not as clearly defined as they might seem at first glance. There are numerous activities that can hop from one category to the other. I mentioned breathing, which can become a conscious thing to an extent. Then there is also driving. Once you have driven on a certain route enough times, it might become second nature, meaning you might not even really pay attention to where you are going or shifting gears. You are only back in the saddle really if something unexpected happens, or you catch your thoughts drifting off. Free will is more of a moment-to-moment thing, not necessarily dependent on the action itself. I think it is fairly intuitive to decide whether something constitutes as the expression of free will based on context, but there are few things I would label as universal examples. Some of you might find this definition agreeable, some of you might not, but I do think most people have a similar idea about free will in their head. Still, I'll make a conscious effort to try and refute the most common contra-free will argument I have heard. I believe it was Robert Sapolsky who first coined this idea. According to him, free will doesn't exist, as people are strictly acting based on their biology and circumstances. It basically hinges on the fact that all living things, including humans, are controlled by their instincts, experiences, hormones, preconceived biases, and numerous other influencing factors. Nobody really makes a choice, but simply acts according to their quote-unquote programming. There is only ever one way a single person would react to an event, no matter how many times we rerun the scenario. If the conditions are the same and we magically rewind the person to be in the same state as they were before the experiment, there is only one outcome. This might be a compelling enough argument, if rather bleak, but it is also something we cannot truly test. Still, before we engage in its deconstruction, let's take a U-turn and refer back to one of the first gripes I mentioned with this topic, the lack of a definition. What even is free will according to this argument? As I've laid out, according to my intuition, free will would simply be conscious actions, things we actively do. The fact that I can make a decision and act upon it is free will enough in my eyes. Naturally, I will be influenced by the millions of years of evolution that has gone into the morphology of my mind and body. What I decide to do is based on what I've gone through in the past, what others have taught me, the time of day, stuff that will happen tomorrow, or what I aim to achieve in the future. This is rather evident, and I don't think there is a thing in the universe that exists and has not been affected by anything, whether it's an inanimate object or a living being. Now, I do not know which exact definition Sapolsky uses, but established dictionaries generally define it as such: freedom of humans to make choices that are not determined by prior causes or divine intervention. Well, it's one of the definitions anyway, the other is more agreeable, if a little vague. So, how can I put this lightly? What a worthless fucking definition of a useless word. I refuse to believe that this is the sense in which people colloquially use the term. If we go by this definition, well, no shit, there is no such thing as free will. It cannot exist. It is an oxymoron. Anything we ever do from the moment our cells start splitting in a womb to the moment we breathe our last, it is all influenced by prior causes. I leave the divine intervention bit out of this, as that is entirely a question of belief and changes little about the definition. You know, creating definitions for words that make them completely useless really riles me up. According to this, free will cannot exist outside of absolute fucking void, as the moment a single thing exists there, it is already influenced by the void, time ticking by, and its own body. Of bloody course we act based on the things that influence us. If I decide not to eat Brussels sprouts, that's because my prior experience tells me they taste like ass. If I decide to try them, that's because my prior experience tells me that my taste in food often changes, and I might like it now. Two opposite choices, equally plausible. These smelly goblin balls cannot enter my body without me making a prior decision that was unaffected by anything. Even if I eat them by accident, not paying attention, the fact that I wasn't paying attention has an underlying reason. Maybe I was having a mental breakdown looking at this wet fart of a definition. Now you see why I wanted to make this video. I don't think people go about their lives thinking that they do not really make choices because stuff inside and outside their body affects them. What even is decision making if not weighing the pros and cons? Just because something you do is the culmination of trillions of cells working together does not diminish its value. On the contrary, I'd say that makes it all the more meaningful. We have a system that has control over them, making their unity far more than the sum of its parts. Just because there isn't some single magical fuck-off entity that makes random decisions devoid of rhyme or reason does not make life an on-rails journey of meaninglessness. So, I'll grant you this, Mr. Sapolsky. Under this definition, free will does not exist. So let's throw out this definition and use something with actual utility instead. Perhaps something that aligns with the general idea of how people lead their lives. But enough about definitions. Let's tackle the idea that if we do not change the circumstances and the participant, only one choice will ever be made in a given situation, no matter how many times we play it back. Possible. Plausible even. As we've discussed, there are numerous factors that affect anyone or anything making a choice. There's always a good reason as to why things happen the way they do. That's the beauty of reality. It is consistent with itself. So, it is quite possible that the outcome will not change if the situation does not change. I only have one question. So what? According to our knowledge of quantum physics, there is a level of true randomness in the universe. Radioactive decay cannot be predicted or influenced. It just happens whenever. We can make statistical predictions, as the law of great numbers does apply to it to an extent. Still, we are not radioactive particles. We've even spent the past 50 minutes discussing how we do not act randomly. Life is in no way influenced by the fact that, in a given situation, we were only ever going to make a single choice. This is what makes us us, and not just grey blobs that may or may not do anything the other blobs do. We have personalities, experiences, quirks. Our biology is unique to an extent. We are not video game characters controlled by the whimsical free will fairy. We have countless options at any given time, and us choosing only one of them does not diminish our freedom. I could stand up from my desk, sneak out and smear goblin balls on the neighbor's new car, but I'm not doing that again. I'm choosing to make this video instead. I don't care if there isn't a multiverse version of myself that makes online gambling videos. I'd like to punch him, but that person wouldn't be me anyway, as I'd never make that choice. This is what makes us individuals, and I'm baffled as to why this is coined as a potential problem. I know for a fact that there are people out there who currently live their lives under the notion that there is no free will, but we all pretend that there is, so we do not go crazy. So they use mental gymnastics to loop back to believing in free will with the added benefit of occasional stress spikes and existential horror. I really don't understand why this is appealing. I do understand that the argumentation can be effective against free will, because it is based on truths. However, the conclusion seems as backwards to me, and the only thing it really proves is that one of the definitions of free will is absolute dogshit. I reiterate, just because we are the sum of trillions of tiny living things does not make us mindless automatons that carry out their programming. It is simply the physical form that allows us to be, to think, to make choices and act according to who we are at every given moment, even if that moment would be magically repeated. Which brings us to why free will is important in world building and fiction. Because, as opposed to this shitty definition, the more agreeable ones do allow for the possibility of its presence or absence. So, assuming that free will is the ability to make conscious choices based on yourself, let's see how fundamentally different a setting can be with or without it. Let's tackle the more common possibility first and talk about worlds where free will exists. Just to reiterate, we are talking about free will where living beings can make choices based on their own character, meaning biology, experience, personality, all that fun stuff. I think we most often watch, read or play stories with the assumption that the participants do act of their own volition. And for good reason, I might add. This is the core of what gives actions weight, both narratively and emotionally. The role the character takes in a particular story is a combination of everything that makes them unique as a person, mixed in with the events they are faced with. It allows us to understand the underlying reasons why they act the way they do. We can see their characterization is consistent, ideally, and that their decisions are not dependent on the whims of the writer. Rather, they were constructed in a way that reflects on them as a person, as opposed to twisting their personality whichever way to make the plot happen. It is also what makes character arcs truly worthwhile. What they go through during a particular tale, their new experiences, the people they meet, and the knowledge they gather leads them to reevaluate prior ideas or develop further opinions and beliefs. Their personality changes based on tangible events and influences in clear or subtle ways. Audiences can relate to them or grow to resent them based on these changes, because it is ultimately part of them. It is not some outside force that drives them towards the desired outcome. They had the potential to process information differently or draw conclusions other than the ones they did. It was not preordained. Or at least that is the illusion. Naturally, since we are talking about constructed stories about fake people, there's this belief to be suspended. Hence, consistency is so important. If there is free will that the characters operate under, making their actions meaningful, the writer has to make us forget that there is a puppet master moving everything along. When constructing the setting, it is easy to say, sure, there's free will, but in practice it takes a lot more effort to manifest that. Now, I would not consider this a writing advice channel, mostly because of how these videos are constructed. That, and I have gained most of my writing experience from unofficial sources through observation and practice. Therefore, I do not have checklists, easy to remember mottos or rule sets to follow. The best I can do is share how I go about it. So, this is what I'm going to do as an attempt to highlight the importance of creating the illusion of free will. For this purpose, I've chosen a character I've been fleshing out lately, whose journey we'll take a brief look at without going into too many details. So, as most characters come to be, she was also created to fulfill a narrative role. The story she takes part in has an overarching theme of family relations with aspects of regret and shame. Most character arcs are supposed to revolve around mending these relations and settling past grievances. We also need a spellcaster and a noble to round out the cast. If she is a noble, that also means we need her to originate from a different part of the world due to the political environment of the region the story is meant to play out in. So we have 4 basic aspects that we want: family issues, arcane abilities, a noble upbringing, and a somewhat distant origin. We can use these 4 fixed points to weave a background for her, and if we focus on her choices and the decisions of those around her to construct it, we also end up with a personality, or personalities to be precise. Let's start with why she is here. Well, the easy answer would be due to the tumultuous family relations, but what are the underlying reasons? Why did she come here? Why now? And what beef does she have with her folk back home? Here's some added bit of context here. In the setting we are talking about, magic use requires exposure to material that has adverse effects. Specifically, it shortens people's lives by a good 30 odd years and causes infertility. It wouldn't make much sense if her family forced her to adopt the trade of a sorceress, as it goes against their own interests in a world where arranged marriages are still an important part of politics. Additionally, if this was forced on her, that makes the conflict one-sided, with her parents clearly being in the wrong, making part of the theme difficult to adhere to. So this should be something she decided to do on her own. To introduce some conflict, we could have her go against her parents' wishes on this one. If she grew up with 2 or 3 brothers but no sisters, that would influence her early development. The majority of kids would want to play games generally preferred by boys, and if she wants to be a part of it, she'll have to grab a stick and whack the others too. However, boys grow up to be lords, knights, men with combat training, and prominent political figures. She will not have the privilege to pursue the same goals. There is an other life path she essentially has to take. Naturally, when her mother starts teaching her about being a lady, how she would marry some unknown man and become a mother herself, her worldview takes a massive hit. Being a kid, she does something rash and stupid to act out, to try and avoid a life she cannot imagine living. She grabs the first opportune moment to run away and try to join an institute of magic. That sorcerers cannot have children is a well-known fact in this world. So it would make a lot of sense that she would try to get rid of the one thing that made her prime candidate to be wed to a distant lordling. Now, becoming ingrained with arcane forces takes quite a bit of time, and we cannot have the tutors at the institute be NPCs. Everyone gets free will, so of course they wouldn't just take in a lone child of a noteworthy family. But what if she forged a letter from her father? That is a damning thing. Even if her actions are rooted in fear and disillusionment. It is a choice she has to make that affects her personality, even though we could take it a couple different ways. Then again, it is still a lone child with a letter, so we need more. The logical step for the tutors, even if we do not fully characterize them, is to accept her request, teach her some minor lessons with no magic involved, and write a letter to her father in the meantime. They would be on the hook if they admitted her with no second thought and immediately put her in a room with the life-sapping material. However, our story calls for her training to be complete, so her parents ultimately agreed to her giving up on becoming a lady. We could tackle this from a couple different angles based on how we write the parents. Her mother could feel betrayed and insulted by this decision, by her one daughter rejecting the life she lived so vehemently, lying and running away to make it impossible to ever be like her. An understandable feeling, but also a character flaw if the mother gives in to her anger. We'll have her father be against it, as their daughter becoming a sorceress would be bad for the family, and for said daughter too. As an adult, he could grasp the finality of the decision she could not as a child, but his wife convinces him to send a letter of confirmation back to the institute. This decision on her parents' part will definitely leave a massive mark on her adult life. A rash choice made with the mind of a child, but agreed to by the people that are supposed to protect her, even from herself. But, still being quite young, she would be grateful for her father's supposed leniency at the time. As a result, we have sort of a slow burn conflict based on the flawed decisions of multiple characters. As time moves forward, once her training is complete, or close to it, she would go through the same changes other women do. Her biology would motivate her to start a family of her own, a choice she no longer has, making her realize the finality of it all. It would be incorrect to say it was ripped from her, but her feeling that way, growing to resent her father for not interfering, would be justified. You see, while her character changed with age, she might still feel an aversion towards starting a family and may even decide against it were she healthy. It is the fact she doesn't have that choice that really frustrates her. By the time of our story, she cannot bear staying with her family, the family she feels abandoned her when she was most vulnerable. She is an adult now, so she has more freedom. Under the guise of trying to improve the political standing of her house, for which our area would be a prime candidate, she runs away again without actually running away. Perhaps she even hopes she could undo her past by some miracle, or find something that brings her solace. Throughout the story, she could grow as a person, better understand the choices made in her past, and potentially mend her relations, forgive. This is of course just a compressed overlook of this person's background with much of the details missing, but I do think it is a good enough example for why free will matters. As you can see, every action and reaction draw their meaning from the fact that the characters had agency. They chose to do these things based on their often incorrect view of the situation, reflections of their personalities. These events are not driven by convenience, in-universe incompetence, or random chance, but rather people acting and interacting. Now, incompetence and random chance can be used in a story, but the more one relies on them, the less satisfying a narrative may become. Remember, the fact that audiences may predict parts of a story is not a bad thing. It simply shows that the characters and world are consistent enough to make such predictions. The subversion of expectations hits hard if the new outcome still makes sense within the framework, and one could also see how and why it happened. Some random shit pulled out of one's ass is generally not conducive of great storytelling. Free will is something most stories would rely on to make us relate to characters and understand them. A lack of it would have the opposite effect, but may, in some cases, actually be useful. So let's discuss what this all entails. The lack of free will may come from numerous aspects of worldbuilding. There may be an architect of fate who determined how everything will go down ahead of time, and the world is kind of like a movie being played. Maybe everything in creation is just a mindless automaton executing its programming with the inability to even react to things changing. Then again, the lack of free will is often accidental, the result of a writer not thinking through the implications of their work. For example, time travel itself is a usual culprit. Things like closed loops, where affecting the past or future can only happen one way, may avert a time paradox, but they also render people cardboard cutouts of themselves. There is no possibility for new information to ever change how something goes down. That means characters cannot think for themselves. They are rendered to do the exact same thing every time with no actual agency. Something like prophecies can have this effect too. If there is an unchangeable future that will come true no matter what, that makes the choices of characters a bit meaningless. Prophecies that are vague or are not set in stone are exempt from this issue, as it allows for choice to influence it. Accurate predictions can be made and do not insinuate a lack of free will if their outcome is not guaranteed, just an educated guess. You might remember, I said it is very possible that, based on people acting according to their own character, it is possible we may only be willing to make one choice under a single scenario, no matter how many times we replay it. It might be easy to extrapolate that there is only one future then. Well, ignoring the innate randomness of the universe, on a small scale, this might be true. However, when the information of a future event is disclosed to a person, that has irrevocably made that future less likely to happen. You may argue that the future might be that way precisely because the person has been told of it. Well, if they have free will, they always have the power to change it. Just to nip this in the bud, let's bring out the most extreme possibility. They take out a gun and shoot themselves in the head to stop that future from happening. That possibility must exist if free will is real. And if that possibility exists, Future cannot be set in stone. Without the existence of free will, if a character makes a choice, a decision, even if it aligns with their personality and motivations, the wind is taken out of their sails by the fact that they could never have made another choice. Not simply because of who they are, but due to cosmic ordeal. If somebody chooses to sacrifice themselves to save others, it doesn't feel as satisfying if they have no actual say in the matter. Villains cannot exactly be held responsible if they were written to do dastardly things by forces out of their control entirely. If there is only one timeline, and things will only ever happen one way due to characters acting of their own accord, that is fine, as long as changes made to any of the events would also reflect in different choices being made. It is the impossibility of any alterations affecting outcomes that really undermines the narrative. Self-correcting timelines can also really defeat the purpose of a story. Imagine that there is a single official sequence of events, and if anyone deviates from it, like being late from work when they aren't supposed to, space cops come out of the woodwork, vaporize them with a stick, then delete their entire universe from existence. That would be absurd, as it means one can make an infinite number of choices in the same situation, and all but one will not be deleted, even if it is something they were very unlikely to do in the first place. But no one would be so psychologically challenged to turn a setting into this nonsensical hellscape. But even other possibilities have a huge detrimental effect. Imagine someone changing the past in a way that makes it impossible for them to have done so. The grandfather paradox, if you will. Also imagine the future twisting and contorting itself to make it possible still, rewriting actions, memories, genetics, matter itself. That would be a world with no object or event permanence, making any story moot, as past, present and future are constantly subject to change, and you have no idea what happens to correct the timeline hiccup and what is actual choice, which may cease to have happened at any given time due to the exploits of time-traveling asshats. Anyway, in a nutshell, choices are meaningless if they are made for the character, not by them. Naturally, this does not apply to coercion or limiting freedom, but more on that in a bit. There's one more elephant in the room. I did say a lack of free will is not automatically bad from a narrative standpoint. Yes, there are a couple of ways it can be used to great effect in a story. However, the more obvious options revolve around the existence of some free will. There can be a lot done with characters gaining or being granted free will after being essentially slaves to a fate made for them. The reverse might be equally fascinating and harrowing too. Imagine being slowly stripped of your agency, losing the ability to fight back in the process. We are firmly in existential horror territory with the latter, but it can be an interesting road to take. A similar thing can be done with a complete lack of free will under any of the possibilities we've discussed. Imagine someone seeing the future, a future that cannot be changed. Them realizing that nothing they do has any effect. They cannot physically commit anything that would stop the events from happening. Alternatively, their memories being rewritten in real time, with the past, future or present changing to accommodate their attempts at making a choice. A truly harrowing experience. On the other hand, what gives an author far more freedom to experience viable and captivating stories is free will that is limited but not absent. Certain things that cannot be possibly done or not done. By this, I do not just mean the limitations of the real world, like existing or controlling time, which cannot be voluntarily stopped or done. More so limitations of personal freedoms by the nature of the universe itself. Depending on how specific these are, they might make the existence of a creator entity necessary, but that is not the only interesting bit. Like laws of physics, the inhabitants of the world would not necessarily see them as infringements on their personal freedoms. They would simply be how the world is, and therefore something they have to work with or around. As a sillier example, let's say dogs cannot be harmed by people. It is forbidden. They simply cannot do it voluntarily. This makes puppers the best kind of armor there is for dueling, but also renders weapons that are less aimed and more lobbed in a general direction more efficient. Maybe the only possible way to shoot down knights clad in dog armor is by closing your eyes and thinking you won't hit the protective gear. This is a more outlandish idea, of course, but I think it gets the point across well. Every deviation from what we can and cannot do would have a ripple effect throughout the world, which is why modern day, exactly as it is but with secret magic stuff, often grinds my gears. Anyway, I think I have laid out my case thoroughly. This was quite an unorthodox episode, as I've already alluded to this. I don't generally go introduce ideas through a simplified version of my world-building project, and I've only made a habit of philosophical ramblings lately. Still, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I might have given you an idea or two. Hey, maybe I made you realize life is not meaningless because we cannot make decisions devoid of influence. It is meaningful because of it. I sure would hope so that is the case for at least a few. I really dislike the doomer attitude of some people. You can be an objective thinker without reducing everything to pointlessness. I do think it is up to us to find meaning, after all. That's it from me for today. Well, this month, more like. Links are in the description, other videos are on the screen, future stuff is on the way, and I'm out the door. Bye.